Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm your host, Eric Tai. Today we're looking outwards to the Taiwanese diaspora in the United States. Today we have TaiwaneseAmerican.org editor-in-chief Leona Chen. TaiwaneseAmerican.org is a living archive and online community for the Taiwanese Americans. Leona, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So first, off the bat, tell me more about, or tell the audience more about what is TaiwaneseAmerican.org.
Sure, so we were founded in 2006, so we turn 20 next year. And it was envisioned by Ho Chi Tai to be this archive where we could contribute to the history of Taiwanese Americans, but also serve as inspirations for Taiwanese Americans who are interested in what this identity means to them. And we've seen that that can take all kinds of shapes and stories. And so I think a really illustrative example of our mission and our values is when I was growing up and reading TaiwaneseAmerican.org as a very young child, we had this 100 Passionate People project, which profiled Taiwanese Americans across 100 different backgrounds and industries and dreams, and it gave me 100 role models to look up to. And we want to create that kind of expansive thinking for all kinds of Taiwanese Americans. So if you are the only Asian at your school in the middle of nowhere and you look up Taiwanese American because you're curious, we want you to feel like the possibilities ahead of you are endless.
You grew up in Fremont, California.
I did.
There's a lot of Asians, not just Taiwanese Americans, but also just Asians in general. What was it like growing up there?
I was so fortunate. I always tell people I grew up exactly in Taiwanese America, where there were so many Taiwanese Americans around me, but also Taiwanese American institutions. So I was born in the late 90s, and so as I was growing up, Taiwanese Americans had achieved sort of this critical mass of institutional legitimacy. And so I had the Taiwanese American Center I could go to. A lot of kids go to Chinese school on the weekends. I went to a Taiwanese school where we learned Taiwanese Taigi as our primary language, and Mandarin was the secondary optional one. Our textbooks were written by volunteers who taught us about Taiwanese industry and history. I grew up really wanting a giant bicycle because I learned about the industry here, and it just gave me such a profound sense of scrappiness and this desire that we were writing our history together. And I was being taught about Taiwanese history by Taiwanese elder activists, which I think infused it with such a sense of purpose and sovereignty and legitimacy as well.
As editor-in-chief of TaiwaneseAmerican.org, you also collected a lot of stories from the community itself. What are some of the stories of people who weren't in as major Asian-heavy cities?
Oh, I love those stories so much because I think it shows what curiosity can lead you towards, and very often the entry point for a lot of people is through food or through stories that their parents tell us. And what we want to be able to do is encourage people to pull on those threads that make them feel like, oh, this might be something that connects me to my culture, and then it connects them to other people as well. During the pandemic, for example, a lot of people were interested in learning Taigi because it felt like the only way that they could maintain conversations with their aging grandparents. And then with so many resources switching to virtual formats like online Taiwanese classes, they were able to do so. And they found that even being able to say a couple of phrases in Taiwanese opened up their grandparents to them and unlocked all of these stories.
Actually, I do want to talk about the change in Taiwan in the geopolitics, especially in America, has changed from obscurity, being confused with Thailand, to now, I don't think pretty much everybody kind of knows what Taiwan is. Some of the terms that we've usually, when you and I, we would discuss about Taiwanese Americans, wanted to dive deeper into what does Taiwanese Americans mean? What is the first, second, third generation? How are these kind of defined?
The earliest waves of Taiwanese immigrants to the US were in the 60s and 70s, and so they had a set of very different political circumstances than new first-gen immigrants who maybe came to the United States in the last 5 to 10 years. Second gen refers to the second generation, so those who are the first to be born and raised in America. So I am a second-gen Taiwanese American. And I think sort of that perspective is more about finding connection to what our parents experienced, but also contextualizing that fully as American-born people. And then the third generation is like my future children. And I think what they will confront is quite a bit of distance from Taiwan, but still an interest in being able to explore their heritage in a meaningful way.
Do you see there are certain times where, because there's so much political tension and the first generation, their parents might come from a specific political background, that the Taiwanese Americans would either shut off or go fully into certain areas? How does the first generation influence the second generation, especially because Taiwan has such a contested history?
That's such a spectrum. I think there's people who are so who were made so intimidated by the political circumstances that their response was sort of shut down all discourse in their own households and really discourage their children from participating in politics because they saw it as a very dangerous thing. There are also some who discouraged it only because they wanted their children to focus on what felt more relevant, which is probably just being able to succeed in the US, focus on education, all of those things. For me personally, I was raised by elder activists who had done so much for Taiwan's democratization movement and made that apparent to me from a very young age.
From your own point of view, do you sometimes find the Taiwan ideology sometimes clashing with almost your identity as being American and with like U.S. politics and or some of the issues that are kind of at heads with each other?
I don't think it's as much of a conflict as it is an opportunity for almost like dual empathy. And so I think about when I went to college in St. Louis, Missouri, at the time we were really reckoning with extreme cases of police brutality. And the way that I was able to connect that with the history that felt very visceral and personal to me was 228 and thinking about the incidents of state violence then. And so I think when you are invested in two different cultures or two different histories, you can find a way to have them speak to each other in a way that feels really hopeful and that teaches you that history repeats itself not just within one lineage but across lineages. And that means you can cross-pollinate learnings and opportunities for resistance and joy as well. And so when I think about the organizing work that I do in the US and how sometimes it's very difficult because there's a lot of interpersonal conflict, I draw strength from the reality that there's never been a movement in history that didn't have this kind of conflict. And I see it in my elders, and therefore I have this source of hope and light to move forward.
You were talking about previously about, you know, the gap sometimes the children, the second generation kind of shut off. What general advice is, or have you seen first generations been coping, like good examples of how they're communicating with second generation so that they continue to care about Taiwan and not be like shut off to a lot of the stuff that's happening within Taiwan in general?
This is not a Taiwanese thing, I think it's a universal thing, but I think when you care about something, people will care about it because you do, but if you are an abrasive personality, maybe they will disavow your politics just because they're yours, you know? And it's not because they disagree with them as principles, but it's because they're embodied in someone that they don't agree with. Something I've been really interested in lately is Taiwanese elder activists who did amazing things for Taiwan, but perhaps weren't the best husbands and fathers, and the kind of complicated legacy that creates, where their kids create a distance or a sense of they're just discouraged from being able to pursue those same politics or showed interest in it because it always was framed to them as something that took someone they loved away from them, out of the house, interested in other things than, you know, their own children. And so I think if you are someone who cares deeply about something, the best way to get your children to have buy-in is to be a good parent or to steward it with a kind of graciousness that gets that kind of social and family buy-in.
We've met a long time ago, and then the times maybe like 10, 15 years ago, the kind of Taiwanese American community, the word Taiwan was oftentimes confused with Thailand maybe. But nowadays with Taiwan being in so many headlines, I think even the person who reads headlines, they're able to know what Taiwan is right now. So what has that led to? And have you ever any stories about like people's seeing the change in how people recognize Taiwan?
So I'm based in the Bay Area, and so there's a lot of talk about tech diplomacy and about Taiwan's competencies as a developer of technology and the industry and the economic impact of that. Over in DC, you no longer have to do this whole long preamble explaining what Taiwan is. There's a very acute awareness and a sophisticated understanding for the most part around the importance of Taiwan. Of course, that tends to be framed in terms of foreign affairs and the military and economic impact, but I think that's a story that resonates as well. But there's also pockets in like food and film and the arts where Taiwanese stories are resonant, and I found a very sympathetic audience.
You spoke about, like, for DC, for example, you've mentioned previously that you have done a visit with congressional aides talking about some of the Taiwan issues. What was that like? You know, what was it like talking to different representatives, congressional aides about Taiwan?
Sure, it was my first time participating, but from my friends who have attended for multiple years, what they really marvel at is previously, 5 to 10 years ago, you had to really explain maybe where Taiwan was on a map or why we care about it or it's important. And then I think in the conversations we have now, all of that has already been established. It's very well understood by both all kinds of political parties in DC, and you get to really focus on tactical and tangible next steps for what they can do to safeguard Taiwan's democracy.
Taiwan is becoming like almost like a geopolitical piece almost. Do you think this kind of puts a pressure on a lot of Taiwanese Americans? I mean, before, again, they were confused with Taiwan and Thailand, and now it's like such a big thing. Do you think this leads to a lot of Taiwanese Americans feeling the need to like almost becoming like geopolitical experts?
It probably does, because it sort of frames what mainstream Americans are concerned about. And if their framing is always around defense and geopolitical tension, then of course that's what they're going to be asked about. And I think Taiwanese Americans are equally curious if most of the music they consume is American and it's always framing Taiwan in that sense. I think it also creates a sort of anxiety that doesn't necessarily get addressed because they don't have as much access to Taiwanese or Mandarin language news.
Previously you said like, you know, unless you're really confident about it, talking about Taiwan almost seems controversial sometimes. One, why is that? And like, how do you think there is a way, or like, how do you talk about it so that it is not a controversial thing, or like how diffuse that kind of hot topic almost?
I wonder if that's because we sort of conflate controversial with complex, and Taiwan is very complex, and I think being nervous about that is what makes you feel like it's probably more controversial than it actually is. I think about the lack of clean and simple symbols we use to tell a Taiwan story, like the flag, for example, and I think there's a lot of anxiety that if you use the wrong symbol, you are almost pledging allegiance to a set of politics you're not ready to do so with. For example, when kids draw the ROC flag and they get sort of scolded by their peers who come from different kinds of families, I think it creates this nervousness of, oh, I don't know if I am telling or endorsing the story that I think I am. But I would really encourage people to lean into that and be really inspired by the fertility of that kind of complexity, where if you can't use a flag, what can you use? What symbols and what designs can you visualize and use to share the Taiwan that you feel like you can strongly stand by?
The bubble tea.
Yeah, the bubble tea, the black bear, like, I think it just creates a lot of creativity and a necessity for creativity that you can do a lot with, where there's no simple narrative, no simple way of sharing Taiwanese culture, which every kid desperately wants to do. And so what do you do with that? You become creative, you brainstorm, you find something else.
I was asked a question once, and I'm going to pose it to you, see how you would answer it, because I don't know what the best answer was. I was talking to a lot of Taiwanese Americans, and one person came up to me and said, hey, you know, our school, we're setting up a bubble tea event for a thing, or we do this every year. Last year, the Chinese student organization came up and was like, we're going to do bubble tea. And they're like, what do I do? Like, you know, like it's bubble tea is a very like Taiwan thing. Like, I don't know if this is like a purposely political thing, or is it just because bubble tea is very popular? I'm gonna take that question, I'm gonna like shift it over to you. How would you answer if someone came up and kind of asked you that kind of situation?
I think we all want to have clear answers about who owns what, but I would use this as an opportunity to say, if two cultures want to share this one thing, how do each of the nations sort of find their own ways to make it unique? So for the Taiwanese organization, maybe there's something special about the origin of the tea, or they use it as an opportunity to teach about the history of Taiwanese tea and boba tea consumption, whereas the Chinese delegation talks more about the contemporary influences in China and like how young people in China like to spend time.
As the last question, where do you see like Taiwanese America, Taiwanese Americans going towards? Where do you hope to see?
I think with such a critical mass of representation at the superficial level, but also in terms of thinking and aspirations, I hope it just frees up their ability to pursue anything they want and not feel like it undermines or threatens their sense of Taiwanese identity. I think before there was this like ongoing narrative that, oh, if you don't follow this specific vocation, you like almost lose your Taiwanese-ness. And we hope that by complicating that and providing all sorts of Taiwanese American stories, you realize you can do anything you want in your life and not undermine or risk that.
Thank you for being here. So this has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. Make sure to like, subscribe, and also leave a comment if you know any Taiwanese Americans or your own Taiwanese American stories. See you next time.